Hello, welcome to the Polyglot Files. My name is Michael and today we're doing another episode of Languages of the World! Each episode in this series looks at a specific country on Earth and explores the languages spoken there. Now, I've gotten a lot of requests for Languages of the World episodes and I'm trying to balance those requests with my own interests. But today I'm happy to announce that I'll be doing a video on one of the countries that has been suggested to me by you all, and that country is Brazil. Despite the fact that Brazil only has one official language, there are actually 210 languages that are spoken in the country, 180 of which are indigenous to the region. But before we delve into those 210 languages though, let's focus on Brazil's official language, Portuguese. Portuguese is the main language of education, the media, and everyday communication in Brazil. Portuguese was brought to Brazil in the 1500s when navigator Pedro Álvares Cabral landed in Brazil and claimed it for the Portuguese Empire. This began 500 years of extracting Brazil wood and then producing sugar and then mining gold and diamonds. And today, Portuguese is spoken by 203 million of the 207 million inhabitants of Brazil. If not natively, then as a second language. The Portuguese language is actually very important in Brazil, as it is a symbol of Brazilian unity, especially when you consider the fact that everybody else in South America basically speaks Spanish. Brazilian Portuguese is almost 100% mutually intelligible with the Portuguese spoken in Portugal, and most of the differences come mainly from accent or word choices. Brazilian Portuguese uses a number of words that have actually been influenced by African and Amerindian languages, and these words are different from the words that are used in the Portuguese spoken in Portugal. For example, ice cream is called
sorvete
in Brazil, but it's called
gelado
in Portugal. A cup in Brazil is called
xícara,
but it's called
taverna,
in Portugal. Lastly, the buttocks is called
bunda,
in Brazil, but it's called
rabo,
in Portugal. And aside from those examples, the biggest differences between Brazilian Portuguese and Portugal Portuguese is actually how speakers address each other. In Portugal, the pronoun
tu
is used to mean you in familiar situations, but the pronoun
você,
is used in formal situations. For example, a speaker might say this phrase in an informal situation,
tu vais à escola,
but might say this phrase in a formal situation.
você vai à escola.
In Brazilian Portuguese, however, this pronoun is used exclusively. That means that whether you're speaking in a formal or an informal situation, you would use this phrase to express what it is that you're saying. Also, it is said that there is a fairly high level of mutual intelligibility between Portuguese and Spanish, and I would imagine that that extends to Brazilian Portuguese as well. Now, I have done a couple Duolingo modules in Spanish, but I definitely haven't studied enough Spanish or Portuguese to be able to actually confirm if that's true. So if you speak Spanish or Portuguese, leave me a comment below and let me know if you can understand the other language. Okay, so what about the remaining 210 languages spoken in Brazil? 180 of these languages are actually indigenous to the region, and they were spoken there before Europeans colonized South America. And secondly, these languages are actually called Amerindian languages. But before I delve into a couple of the languages themselves, I wanted to first talk about what the word Amerindian means. If you watched my Languages of Russia video, you will recall that I talked about a group of languages called the Caucasian languages. What was interesting about these languages was that even though they were all grouped under the same language family, they were not actually related to each other linguistically. They were just grouped together for the purposes of geography. The same thing can be said for the Amerindian languages. In fact, the Amerindian languages are spoken over a wide landmass, going all the way from the northernmost tip of North America to the southernmost tip of South America. And these languages are actually grouped together because they are indigenous to the Americas. Even though some of these languages may have common linguistic lengths, for the most part, a lot of these languages aren't related to each other at all. So anyway, now that that distinction is out of the way, let's tackle some of the Amerindian languages spoken in Brazil. Up until the late 19th century, Nheengatu was one of the most widely spoken Amerindian languages in the country. In fact, Nheengatu was actually used as a lingua franca, or a common language between the Europeans and the indigenous peoples in South America. Since then, however, Nheengatu has lost a lot of its prominence. Today, there are only about 3,000 speakers of Nheengatu in Brazil. However, its relative Guarani hogs a little bit more of the spotlight. Despite a pretty small group of speakers in Brazil, Guarani is actually a pretty popular language in neighboring Paraguay, where it is spoken by an estimated 4.5 million. Guarani has a subject, verb, object, word order, and English speakers actually know more Guarani words than they think they do. English has adopted quite a few Guarani words, such as jaguar and piranha, and in fact, even the country names, Paraguay and Uruguay, come from the Guarani language. Further, there are quite a few Amerindian languages in Brazil that are pretty interesting, even in spite of the fact that they haven't been able to keep a lot of speakers post-European colonialization. For example, you may remember a pretty cool language isolate that I spoke about in a previous video, called Warao. Warao is a language spoken in Venezuela, and it is one of the only languages on Earth that has an object, subject, verb, word order. Well, despite the rarity of that language, it seems that object initial languages are kind of a thing in South America. For example, Hixkaryana is a language spoken by about 600 people in the Amazonas state in Brazil, and it is one of the only languages to have an object, verb, subject word order. For example, the sentence, "the jaguar ate the man," is actually literally translated as the opposite. The man ate the jaguar. If we look at this phrase in its native Hixkaryana, we can see why this confusing translation occurs. The first word, highlighted in red, means the man, and even though it is at the beginning of the sentence, and our mind wants to think that this would be the subject or the actor in the sentence, it is actually the object, or the thing being acted upon by the verb eat. Now if we go to the end of the sentence, we have the word for jaguar, highlighted in green. And again, though it's tempting to think that this is the object of the sentence, or the thing being eaten simply because it's at the end of the sentence, it is actually the thing doing the eating, the subject. And Hixkaryana is not the only language in Brazil to do this. There's also the Apalai language, spoken by about 450 people, as well as the Taparape language, spoken by about 655 people. And the linguistic oddities of Brazilian languages don't stop there. Piraha is another language spoken in Brazil, doing some pretty odd things, and it is spoken by about 300 people in the Amazonas state. Despite not having a whole lot of speakers, Piraha is actually pretty well known in the linguistic community because it provides evidence for a theory called linguistic relativity. Linguistic relativity, in a nutshell, means that a person's understanding of the world, or a person's understanding of reality, is actually shaped by the language that they speak. This means, for example, that speakers of German might actually understand the world differently than speakers of Japanese, simply because they use different systems to conceptualize reality. But what does this have to do with Piraha? Well, a researcher named Daniel L. Everett stayed with the Piraha people, and he learned through his study that the Piraha language actually lacked exact number terms, or ordinal numbers. This means that Piraha doesn't have a word for 1 or 2 or 55,378. Instead, Piraha only has general quantity terms. For example, they might use a word like this to talk about a small quantity, and inversely, they might use a word like this to talk about a large quantity. Further, even when Everett and his wife tried to teach the Piraha people exact numbers, they remained unable to use them. He discovered that they could memorize them, but when it came to counting or doing simple mathematical operations, they completely forgot how the numbers worked. Everett claims that the Piraha people were unable to learn numbers simply because their language didn't have any numbers in it. Therefore, their cognition was constrained by their language. Such conclusions have obviously completely shaken the linguistic community, but these findings could have pretty dangerous implications, especially for those who would try and equate linguistic relativity with an overall impression of somebody's intelligence. Oh, and with the setting sun, it looks like that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for watching the Polyglot Files. My name is Michael. You can find all my social media information, such as my Twitter, my Facebook, and my Instagram over here. And also, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I will see you next time. Bye!